the conference, The Way of Making WSP Compulsory in Germany. We invite Bettina Rickert to come to the stage. Bueno, she is here on stage. Thank you very much. Bettina is an environmental engineer working with the German Environment Agency. She's the head of the WHO Collaborating Center for Research on Drinking Water Hygiene and has more than 14 years of experience in the water sector. She has supported WS projects and trainings in different settings, including training of WSP facilitators. Furthermore, the supports WHO works on smaller scale water supplies on WSP. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I hope the interpreters can hear me. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to be speaking to you at this important and interesting event. And I would like today to take you on a journey, and that's our journey that we took in Germany towards making water safety plans a legal obligation. And I would like to put a particular focus on stakeholder engagement, because we've got a lot of stakeholders, and I think that was an interesting journey we took there. And I would like to start with a question to you. And don't worry, it's not a test exam. I know this is not a room full of Germans. I would just like to make a wild guess. What do you think when water safety plans were introduced as a legal obligation in Germany? Was it A in 2003? B in 2013, or was it C in 2023? So just raise your hands. Anybody who thinks it was A, 2003, please raise your hand. There's a few there. Who thinks it was 2013? A lot more hands there. And who thinks it was 2023? A few less hands. Well, guess what? It was as recent as last year that we got legal obligations for water safety plans. 2003 was the year when the book Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix was published. 2013 was when in Germany we introduced a new threshold for lead, which could only be achieved if you had no lead pipes in the plumbing system. So that was a way of banning lead pipes without actually banning them. And only in 2023 did we get the legislation for water safety planning in Germany. Now let's embark on this journey together. And first I would like to introduce to you the destination, Germany. It's a small country, about 360,000 square kilometers, so about double the size of Uruguay, but it's much more densely populated. We've got about 84 million people living there. When it comes to the water sector, the regulation is mostly under the Ministry of Health. And what you see here in green is a map of Germany, and the white lines are the borders between the 16 federal states. And each of those federal states, again, has their own Ministry of Health. And we've got about 400 local health authorities that are responsible for the surveillance. So it's a lot of authorities already involved. When it comes to the drinking water supply sector, we've got about 70% using groundwater. And again, we've got a lot of water supplies. So we've got about 2,500 large water suppliers. We've got about 6,700 small ones that provide water to 11% of the population. And we've got about 200,000 private wells that provide water to up to 50 people. And all of those are regulated. All of those have to analyze their water regularly. All of those are subject to regular independent surveillance. So again, it's a lot of stakeholders, it's a lot of work, and the small water supplies are a particular focus of our national work, and I'm happy to see that this is one of the focus themes also of this conference, because yes, it is often small systems, but big challenges they are facing. And now let's start the journey. It started in 2003, around the time when WHO was first recommending risk management in their guidelines for drinking water quality, and also roughly around the time when I graduated from university. We had a first international water safety conference inviting international experts to report on their experiences, but also particularly on benefits and challenges they were facing with risk management and water supplies. To this conference, we also invited local stakeholders, including water suppliers, and the idea of introducing something new like the risk management wasn't a big hit from the start. One of the reasons, I think, is because we already had rather high compliance rates. So the compliance with the drinking water thresholds are typically around 99 to 100%, depending on the parameters. So it wasn't clear why anything new, anything on top should be done. Adding to that, we've already got comprehensive drinking water legislation, and to complement that, a set of about 300 technical standards that describe, for example, how to run a treatment properly, or a distribution system, or to manage a water supply. So there's already a lot there, and it wasn't really clear in the beginning to a lot of the stakeholders, particularly the water suppliers, why risk management would bring them any benefits. In order to gather national experience and also to gather arguments why it's a good idea to do that, we initiated a number of pilot projects. One was starting with water safety plans in 5 supplies. And yes, also their benefits could be seen. That was not so much on hard evidence like compliance rates, but more on improved communication, improved stakeholder exchange, improved documentation. In this first pilot project, we also had the German Association of Gas and Water Suppliers on board, the DVGW, which is the main body issuing the technical standards for drinking water. And they reviewed their set of drinking water standards, and they also found that the risk thinking was not completely integrated yet, and they came up with a new technical standard, the W1001, which describes how to do risk management for German water supplies. We had another pilot project on water safety plans in building installations, again, another priority topic of this conference, and we focused on priority buildings such as schools, care facilities, etc., so not so much small residential buildings. And another pilot project on water safety plans in small supplies to see whether it's also approach feasible for small supplies, and if yes, what support and what tools, for example, they would need for implementation. In 2013, at the European level, a new technical standard came out, the EN 15975 Part 2. And why I've listed that here is because it is almost completely what was included in the German technical standard before. So that was transposing the German national technical standard knowledge to the EU level and to make it applicable also to different settings. Then in 2014, as an outcome of the pilot project, we published the guidebook for water safety plans in small systems that is translating the often technical, theoretical language of the technical standards, etc., into more easy to understand, more accessible language for the small water supply operators. And it also provides a set of templates that are ready to use. And as sometimes is the case with such things, we've also heard from large water suppliers that they don't mind using this guidebook that's easy to understand and easily accessible. We had another workshop in 2014 focusing on the European countries to also show that it works next door, and to learn from neighboring countries that already had legislation in place, that already had, for example, electronic tools for the water suppliers on how to apply this approach. And often you get more improvement when you've got a regulatory push. Now in 2015, what we got was not quite a regulatory push, but I'd rather call it a regulatory nudge. As a member state of the European Union, we are bound to the EU legislation, and that's in the drinking water sector, mostly the European Drinking Water Directive that's come out initially in 1998. And that is regularly reviewed and, if needed, updated. And in 2015, the annex of this directive was updated, allowing for risk-based adaptation of the scope of parameters to be analyzed and of the frequency of analysis. The reason behind that was because in many EU member states, the compliance levels are relatively high. So you're analyzing for a lot of parameters where you can be relatively sure already there's nothing there. So you're using the resources where you might rather better use them if you are targeting them more. And that's why this risk-based approach was introduced, stipulating that water suppliers could reduce the scope of parameters or the frequency in case they had done a risk assessment as a basis showing that the parameter is also very unlikely to be in the system at all. We had a first national workshop on how to implement that in Germany just about a month after the legislation came out, to get all the stakeholders on board and discuss with them how we could actually do that in Germany. And even though it was just a few weeks after the legislation came out, there were still complaints saying, well, you up there and the EU level is doing whatever you want to without listening to us, which showed us mostly how important it was to initiate this stakeholder coordination and communication process as early as possible and to come up with an approach that is doable in the national context. Now, when new EU legislation comes out, you typically have 2 years for the national transposition. We almost made it. So in January 2018, we revised our drinking water ordinance. That is the funny abbreviation starting with T here. I won't bother you with a German term. That was introducing the risk-based monitoring as an optional approach. So water suppliers could decide to either stick with the full scope of parameters and frequency or do a risk assessment to reduce that. The pickup was very slow, and I think the main reason behind that was that the bait that was initially put out was you might save money if you're reducing the scope of parameters, if you're analyzing less frequently. And that didn't quite turn out like that in practice. For example, the laboratories would have a price for all the heavy metals. If your risk assessment showed that you can reduce 1 or 2 of those parameters, you would still have to pay for the whole set of parameters. So the motivation couldn't be purely financial, and that's why the pickup was also very slow with the water suppliers. And one of the pioneers who was one of the first to apply that, it was a very large water supplier, and he also clearly communicated that for him it was mainly a tool to get all the stakeholders together. He had to report to a number of health authorities. He had to talk to a number of stakeholders from the catchment. And for him, it was mainly a tool to get everyone together and to agree on a way forward. When the new legislation came out, at the same time, we also published guidance on how to do it, what information to consider for the application, and also how to document it to the authorities. And we also published water safety plan training materials, which are available for free to everyone who wants to use them. And there was also some criticism, why are you doing water safety plan training materials? In the legislation, it's only the risk assessment, not the risk management. Well, we decided early on to make training materials for this holistic approach. We use a color coding saying this one color is what's in the legislation, this other color is what you could do on top. But we were already anticipating that there might be legislation coming from the EU requiring the whole risk assessment, plus from our point of view, the risk management is the more holistic and the more feasible approach rather than doing the risk assessment only. Excuse me. In 2020, we also published some explanatory videos that are available on YouTube. We've also translated them into English by now. And we published a guidebook on water safety plans in buildings as an outcome of the other pilot project. And then finally, in 2020, pretty much as a Christmas present, in December, the new EU legislation came out that now required a much more comprehensive risk-based approach all the way from the catchment to the consumer's taps, with a revision of the EU directive. And again, we had 2 years for the transposition into national legislation. Again, we almost made it. So rather 3 than 2 years later, we had 2 different pieces of legislation for the national transposition of this risk-based approach. One was the Drinking Water Ordinance and the other the Drinking Water Catchment Ordinance. For the catchments, this new ordinance on drinking water catchment areas has been developed under the lead of the Ministry of the Environment. And that was an interesting but also important experience, because the environmental sector was not necessarily so much used to dealing with drinking water hygiene questions. They were focusing more on environmental questions. And so it was a very long but also useful exchange between the 2 sectors to learn from each other and to learn where there's actually new aspects and where it was maybe just a matter of learning vocabulary that the other sector is using. And you may remember from earlier on, we have 1 national ministry, we've got 16 federal state ministries, we've got several hundred local authorities. Well, we have that for the health sector, we've also got that for the environmental sector. So again, it was a lot of exchange until we got to this new legislation. And before I was working in this position, I sometimes wondered why it takes 2 years for the national transposition of EU legislation. Well, now I know. That it really also takes that long to come up with something that's accepted and that's actually implemented. For the risk-based approach in the supply and then the building installations, it was about a revision of an existing legislation, which is the Drinking Water Ordinance, which is under the lead of the Ministry of Health. And now to briefly show you what this legislation now entails. For the catchment, the ordinance requires that the water suppliers are doing a risk assessment for their catchments. And I think the position of the water supply sector is very much strengthened, because the legislation says if the water suppliers don't have sufficient information to do so, the water authorities have to provide them with this information. So they are entitled to ask the authorities for additional information, for example, on catchment uses that is otherwise not easily accessible to them. They then do the risk assessment, submit the documentation to the authorities, and with this documentation they can propose to the authorities risk management measures where they have identified high risks and where they don't have enough authority to actually take action in the catchment. So it's a strong linkage also between the water suppliers and the water authorities. Now, in the Drinking Water Ordinance, the risk assessment and risk management has to be done by the water suppliers, and they then submit the documentation to the local health authorities together with a proposal what parameters they want to analyze for in the future and how often and where. And the authority then either accepts that proposal or asks for a revision. I'm very much looking forward to attending the session on auditing water safety plans, because we will be doing our first steps into water safety plan auditing in the coming years. And it will be very helpful for us to hear how other countries are doing it and what challenges to look out for and what best practices to apply. Already within the legislation, we have a clear link between the catchment and the water supply, because the Drinking Water Ordinance clearly says whatever is done in the catchment needs to be used as a basis for the risk assessment in the water supplies. And for this, the documentation also has to be submitted from the catchment area to the health authorities so that they know what is going on in the catchment, which may be particularly important if you have different water suppliers responsible for the catchment and the abstraction, and then a different water supplier doing the treatment and the distribution. We all know legislation, and it's usually more at an overarching level and just giving rough guidance. So in order to go into more detail, what needs to be done in practice, a working group has been established by the federal states ministries for the environment to develop guidance for the authorities. And the German Association for Gas and Water Suppliers has drafted a technical standard on how to do the risk assessment in the catchments for the water suppliers. Similarly, for the Drinking Water Ordinance, there's a working group that is developing documentation requirements for the documentation submitted by the water suppliers to the authorities. With the thinking behind it also, we've got 16 federal states, we've got 400 local authorities. You would want to unify the approach to make sure that also if a water supplier is acting not just within the scope of one public health authority, but several ones, they know what to document and how to document it. And similar to the catchments, there's also a plan to develop a technical standard for the water suppliers on how to implement those new requirements. So as you see, these working groups are still ongoing, so the journey has been started 20 years ago, but it's still ongoing, and it will be ongoing. The first implementation in the catchment is required until November next year. The first implementation in the drinking water supplies until 2029, and then it's got to be revised every 6 years. So we will continue to be on this journey. And let me now flag a few challenges. Is again small systems. So the very small systems are completely exempted from this approach. They don't have to do a risk management. But it will also be challenging for the small public supplies to implement this new requirement. And the Drinking Water Directive gives some flexibility when it comes to that. In Germany, we've decided to not exempt the small public water supplies, but to give them a few more years for implementation. That has mainly two advantages. On the one hand, they can learn from the experience that the large water supplies already gather in the first years. And the local health authorities will also not receive the documentation from all the water supplies, including the small ones, at once, but over a period of some years. So they will have, hopefully, sufficient time to review that. Another challenge, and that's already been mentioned several times also in the opening remarks, is climate change. And you see here again a map of Germany, this time showing the different climate types. It's starting from the coastal climates shown in blue and green in the north of the country, all the way, all the way to the mountain ranges in the south. And it is expected with climate change that we are not going to face an overall lack of water quantity across the country in the future. However, that may look very different at the local level. And we had very dry and hot summers between 2018 and 2020. And we know that at least there were regions where the private wells that are usually using the first groundwater layer fell dry and already had quantity issues. We are also expecting an acceleration in sea level rise, an increase in extreme weather events, and especially also when it comes to droughts and heat waves. This is something that is going to affect some regions more than others, and especially the rural areas. So we've got a double challenge there. And both the EU legislation as well as the national legislation require that risks related to climate change should be considered, whatever that means. So it's not going into more detail, and that will be interesting to find a way how to actually integrate that. And we've started a pilot project that will look into what climate data is actually available in Germany, to what extent that is for a local condition, or is it broader information? Is it in a format that the water suppliers can easily use? And then we're also going to pilot that in 3 water supplies in different regions across Germany. And now I would like you to show some of the resistance, some of the complaints we got when trying to introduce water safety plans in Germany. And feel free to nod in the audience if this is something you've heard before. So one typical argument was, it's too complicated, it's too much work. We can't do that, it's too extensive. Furthermore, it doesn't pay off, it's not commercial. We have to make, ends meet with the money we receive from the tariffs, and it's not going to pay off, it's not going to work. And why do you come up with that now? Like 50 years ago, yes, we may have needed that, but now, drinking water is good. Why would we do that now? And I've seen some nodding across the room, so it's something some people at least have heard before. And trust me, it's not exclusive to the water sector, because these were some arguments that J.K. Rowling had to listen to when she was submitting her Harry Potter manuscript to publishers. And we all know by now that it is kind of accepted now, and it was kind of a success, and I think, at least for her, it seems to have paid off. And if you're wondering why I'm standing here talking to you about water safety planning and what's my motivation, I mentioned on one of the first slides that the time when the process started in Germany was roughly around the time when I graduated from university. And the topic of my final thesis was the water safety plans of the WHO guidelines for drinking water quality in comparison to the European and German legislation. Little did I know that 20 years down the road I would be involved in shaping this legislation, and that this would even bring me to beautiful countries like Uruguay. So that's my motivation, and I hope together with you I can continue to work on making water safety planning as successful as Harry Potter. So thanks a lot for your attention. Sorry? Yeah. Are there any questions in the audience?
Can you tell us the principal troubles and lessons learned you identify along this trip of water safety plans last 10 years?
In the last 10 years, I would say it was mostly about coming from this thinking that it's something to save money with, towards something that's actually useful because it is making the water supply safer, and to make clear that it's some tool also to identify gaps, and they don't have to be big gaps. It doesn't have to mean you're doing something wrong just to have benefits from this approach. So I think that was a hard way of communicating. And I think our opening gate was the small-scale water supplies, because their communication and documentation is more important often than in the larger water supplies. You've got one person responsible for the whole thing, and if that person changes jobs, falls ill, etc., then you see bigger advantages through the application. And interestingly, the argument was often that the small water supplies can't do it. It's too much for them. But that was an argument that often came from the large water suppliers. The small ones themselves didn't think they couldn't do it. They were quite confident. It was more the others thinking that, for them it's too much to do. So I think that's the main points.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any further questions, so thanks a lot for listening again.